Hi, this is the Anarcha Archive. I'm J.C. Hallman, and this time we're digging into the question of how Anarcha moved from Alabama to Richmond and then to New York City. In our last video, I showed how it was that I had concluded that the Anarcha who appeared in the case register of Woman's Hospital in New York City in 1856 was the same as the Anarcha we've seen in documents from Alabama. The question now is, how and when did Anarcha leave Alabama?
Whoa, 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 whoa.
In 1853, there was a terrible train wreck in Norwalk, Connecticut. A train missed a signal that a bridge over a drawbridge, was still raised. The train went sailing into the gap, and more than 50 people died. At the time, it was one of the worst train wrecks in the history of the United States. Now, in earlier videos, we documented how Betsy's original enslaver was a man named Nathan Harris. And the documents suggest that partway through the Alabama fistula experiments, Nathan Harris became the enslaver of all of the women who were part of the earliest experiments of J. Marion Sims. And now, get this, Nathan Harris was on the train that went sailing into the draw in Norwalk, Connecticut. The Norwalk wreck received extensive press coverage all across the country, and the story of how Nathan Harris of Montgomery, Alabama, was rescued was one of the more colorful episodes from the news coverage. And he wasn't alone. Nathan Harris was traveling with several members of his family, including 3 children and a nurse. As we saw in earlier videos, Anarcha had worked as a nurse as a young girl. She had worked as a nurse during the fistula experiments, and according to Sims' own account, she, Lucy, Betsy, and the others became nurses for the experiments as well. Nathan Harris would most certainly have known this. It makes perfect sense that he would have brought Anarcha along as an experienced nurse on the Harris family journey to the north. So that's possibility 1. Possibility 2 takes us back to J. Marion Sims. This is Thomas Addis Emmet. Not long after Sims moved to New York in 1853, in fact, he barely missed being on that train crash, he set about starting his own hospital, known as Woman's Hospital, which opened in 1855. After some fits and starts, he took Thomas Addis Emmet on as his assistant surgeon. Emmet was from Virginia. After studying medicine at UVA and Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, which was also Sims' alma mater, Emmet worked at the Emigrant Refuge Hospital on Ward's Island, just across the East River from Manhattan. He had come to know Sims even before Woman's Hospital opened. Thomas Addis Emmet, like Nathan Bozeman, who we talked about in earlier videos, was Sims' assistant, but he went on to become one of Sims' greatest critics. Decades later, Emmet and Sims had a terrible feud, and Emmet would more or less always describe Sims as a mentor figure, but some of the worst things ever written about Sims came from Emmet's pen. And probably, Thomas Addis Emmet had a greater claim to being the father of gynaecology than Sims ever did. Anyway, the strange thing when it comes to the story of Anarcha is that Emmet, who was from Virginia and who was now working in New York, starts turning up as a witness in legal documents in Alabama. The first clue about what's going on here comes from Sims himself. He says that he was moved to take on Emmet as an assistant because Emmet had married a woman that Sims had known for many years, since his days in Alabama. Not only that, Thomas Addis Emmet's signature appears on pages that also include Anarcha. A short time later, Thomas Addis Emmet was signing documents as a witness that included Anarcha's name. So what's going on here? In an earlier video, we described how Nathan Harris had come to be the enslaver of Sims' experimental subjects. After 1849, it appears they lived at the home of John Duncan in Autauga County, Alabama. John Duncan had 3 children: John Duncan Jr., who was Nathan Harris's law partner, Margaret Duncan, who became Nathan Harris's wife, and Catherine Duncan, who I said would become essential to Anarcha's story. To reiterate, Sims' assistant in New York City married, in Alabama, the sister-in-law of the man who enslaved Anarcha in 1853. It's possible to piece together a little more. Emmet's autobiography specifies that he met Catherine Duncan at a water cure in New England, not long after the Norwalk train accident. Catherine Duncan was also on the train that went sailing into the Norwalk River. After the wreck, she didn't go home. She went to the water cure and met the man who would soon become the first assistant to J. Marion Sims. Emmet's autobiography says that after his wedding, which took place in Nathan Harris's home, he and his new wife went on a tour of the South on their way back to New York. It would have been easy for Emmet to take Anarcha to Richmond, Virginia. There's an important point to make here. Sims began telling the fanciful story of his cures of Anarcha and the others as soon as he arrived in New York. He began pitching a new hospital within months, and soon he was quite well known in the city. But we also know now that Anarcha was not actually cured. After all, she was going to be experimented on again very soon in Richmond and then in New York. And it's right in this time that Emmet travels to Alabama and gets married in a house where it's very likely that Anarcha is living. And Emmet would have been able to tell in an instant that the young woman who was already being described as Sims' first cure was not actually cured. What happens next is that Anarcha leaves Alabama for more experiments in Richmond, and Emmet is suddenly chosen to be Sims' assistant. This was the position that would define his career. And that would seem to explain why Thomas Addis Emmet also never revealed that Anarcha had been treated in New York City. Next time, we'll begin to investigate what happened to Anarcha in Richmond, Virginia.
Whoa, whoa,